Hi, welcome to a LawInSport Insight with me, Sean Cottrell, the founder of LawInSport. Today I'm joined by two guests, Shea and Daniel Geey. They're going to be discussing with me some of the legal issues that are affecting the football industry at the moment. Daniel is a senior associate at Firsher Waterhouse. He also has his Twitter handle, which is, Daniel, remind me?
Football law, quite easy.
And Shea, who's an associate at Morgan Cole. John, remind me of your Twitter handle?
FC Legal.
FC Legal. Both of them are very...
I think his is better than mine, I quite liked it when I saw yours.
I like yours. Yeah.
Okay. This is a mutual appreciation society going on here with mine.
Always swap.
And so, you can follow both of them on Twitter. They're both very active guys and they know their stuff about the legal issues in football. They both write regularly for LawInSport and on their own respective blogs. So to start off, guys, well, thanks a lot for joining me.
A pleasure.
You look so happy. It's late in the day, I know. So thanks for taking time out of your day. I wonder if you can just start off, maybe Daniel, what do you think at the moment is sort of one of the biggest issues affecting football, legal issues affecting football at the moment?
Well, I know I sound like a one-trick pony at the moment, but a lot of the things that I'm seeing and doing are involving financial fair play, and there's obviously a large multitude of interesting things going on at the moment. But what we were discussing last week, especially, and what we blogged on recently, was the Belgian agent Striani's challenge to the UEFA FFP rules, and I think, and it's a competition and EU law effective challenge, which has a number of really interesting facets involved from an EU procedure and a substantive point of view. So, UEFA may have been ramping up for predicting something like this coming, but even so, it's come. The challenge and complaint has been issued to the European Commission, and there's lots and lots of interesting things on the horizon for the way this will go now.
And do you think they're going to take this quite seriously, or how is it going to progress?
Well, the Commission definitely has to take it seriously now. There's been a complaint made, so the Commission at some point has to make a decision on the complaint, which is either to take it forward as a legitimate complaint which has competition and free movement issues to be thought through, or actually reject the complaint. And at that rejection point, then an appeal can be made to the General Court and eventually to the Court of Justice. And what we were talking about earlier last week was, in the end, this isn't going to, almost certainly not going to be a quick process. This is going to be probably 3-4 years on, presumably. And I've read a lot on LawInSport about the listing of events cases, and that's gone through the General Court to the Court of Justice, and we still haven't reached a verdict from the Court of Justice, and this has been 4 or 5 years in the making. So similar procedures, similar processes, which doesn't look like it's going to be quick outcomes.
So in the short term then, it's not really going to affect what UEFA are doing at this moment in time, or what the Premier League are doing. They're just going to carry on as they had planned, and then depending on the outcome, make whatever changes are necessary, if any are.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, I was looking actually at the Commission procedure notice, and without going into too much detail, there are interim measures that the Commission can actually impose on the entity that is being complained about. So those are usually in very exceptional circumstances, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that an interim measure may be made to actually suspend part of the UEFA reg, even though I would say it's extremely unlikely. And then from the other angle, from the Premier League and Championship FFP perspective, there actually hasn't been a complaint about that set of regulations, even though it's based on the similar break-even principles, and presumably that would have to come through an OFT complaint, because that's effectively domestic regulations rather than the European context of UEFA side of things.
So the backdrop of all this, I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with it, is they're trying to introduce financial stability in football. There's been some mismanagement. There's been a tendency for players' wages to be inflated. And coming on to John, there's been a number of clubs that have gone insolvent in recent years. And I wondered if, given your expertise in insolvency law, I wonder if you could give us a bit of your insight into this. Do you think it's going to be effective? Do you think it's going to have the necessary impact that they're hoping for?
Yes, of course. I mean, like you alluded to, there've been many examples of football clubs facing financial difficulties in recent years. Most notable ones in England have been Leeds United in 2007 and Portsmouth in 2010, who were the first Premier League club to enter administration. There obviously been, there are many reasons why a football club faces financial difficulties. There's obviously factors given the current financial climate, obviously just general poor management. But I think the main reason has been just aggressive, excessive spending in terms of transfer fees and wages in order to sort of maintain or strive for long-term success, which has either sort of failed or has not been sustainable on a long-term basis. And Leeds and Portsmouth have been classic examples of that. With Leeds United under Peter Ridsdale, qualifying for the Champions League, getting to the semi-finals of the Champions League after spending heavily on players. But it proved not to be sustainable in the long term, and obviously they got relegated down to the Championship, entered administration, ultimately ended up in League One. Obviously they're back in the Championship now. And similar in Portsmouth's case, because under Harry Redknapp they got promoted to the Premiership. They spent heavily on players in order to stay in the Premier League and also to try and get into Europe. They won the FA Cup, but again it did not prove successful in the long term, and obviously they faced financial difficulty and entered administration and on two occasions now. So the idea of obviously under the financial fair play regulations is for clubs to be self-sustainable. The rationale of the break-even requirement is for clubs not to spend any more than what they earn. And this, in theory, should hopefully curb excessive spending on transfers and wages, and encourage better sort of financial management, and sort of encourage and promote investment in other areas such as youth development and stadiums, etc. Hopefully, this will reduce the number of clubs facing financial difficulties, but time will tell whether the regulations are going to be robust enough to prove that to be the case.
And does this mean less work for you then, as an insolvency lawyer, in theory?
Who knows? I hope so. I hope not. Sorry.
That was a fraudulent slip there.
Yeah. But no, hopefully, as a football fan, no football fan wants to see football clubs have any financial difficulties whatsoever. There's clearly been too many football clubs being mismanaged, and there should never be any risk for a football club to go under as such. So hopefully that's the rationale behind financial fair play, and hopefully this will ensure better stability at football clubs.
And do you think then, because there's been more recent examples of clubs experiencing financial difficulty, and obviously prudent financial management is key, but also is good corporate governance and good business acumen. So you might have a sound financial basis, but some bad business decisions that are made. Are there any more recent examples that you can give of clubs that have gone into administration and cite the reasons why?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to Leeds and Portsmouth because they obviously they're the big clubs who have certainly entered administration. Those two cases were predominantly down to excessive spending or reckless spending, if you like, in order to obtain success. Whether that was down to the actual owners behind it, way they actually ran the club. Obviously, they had certain inputs to sanction that excessive spending. But whether financial fair play is going to actually limit the sort of the owners themselves, whether that's going to prohibit them to manage the club in any way they want is another matter. I mean, one club at the minute which is being criticised heavily for the way it's been run is Blackburn Rovers, although they haven't suffered any insolvency at the minute, but they're certainly being criticised about the way they're being run and being managed, and perhaps obviously there's owner and directors tests out there to ensure that proper owners are being employed by football clubs. But whether there could be more and better, tighter regulation in respect of of owners and directors coming into football clubs, that perhaps could be looked at.
Daniel, what's your view on that?
Well, I was just going to take a slightly different example, which is I think it's going to be pretty topical come the next couple of months, which is the Malaga CAS decision that's brewing at the moment, which is they were sanctioned by the club financial control body as part of the wider UEFA licensing regime, which didn't take into account break-even, but was to do with the overdue payables provisions, which is effectively saying that if clubs owed money to the tax authorities, to players, or to other clubs, and those liabilities weren't settled within a certain amount of time, that those clubs could be sanctioned effectively, ultimately, with expulsion from UEFA club competition. And we're getting to the stage now with Malaga, even though they're protesting their innocence and they've appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne, that probably come end of June, beginning of July time, we're going to know whether, if Malaga actually qualify for European competition in the next 3 seasons, whether they can actually play in there. So that CAS decision, which will ultimately be made public and accessible, is the non-confidential version, I think will be really interesting reading as one of the first CAS club financial control body major decisions on expulsion of a large-ish club in one of the four big footballing countries, really. And I think that will have major implications on, firstly, overdue payables issues, but secondly, actually, on whether the wider public perception is that UEFA its sanctioning regime actually tested correctly, and that they've got the teeth to be able to sanction clubs who effectively breach their provisions. So watch out for that, probably towards the end of June, beginning of July.
And it's interesting with the overdue payables is that obviously it's almost like it is a separate provision within UEFA's licensing requirements, and obviously the break-even requirement is to hopefully curb excessive spending, but also the overdue payables is to ensure that clubs don't incur excessive debt as well, and to ensure that their debts are paid in a timely manner. That there's no real such provisions within the Premier League or the Football League regulations on a domestic basis, which kind of encourages football clubs to pay their debts in a timely manner. And so perhaps there could be some tighter regulation on the lines of what UEFA have done within their licensing requirements to encourage clubs on a domestic basis to do so as well. I'm not sure what Daniel thinks about that.
Yeah, well, the only point I was going to mention there is that I know that the Premier League and the Football League, especially the Football League, I know because I looked into it quite recently, have their quarterly club submissions that they make to the Football League to ensure that they're up to date with their tax authority liabilities. And that also from the Premier League perspective, they do have to usually provide future financial forecasts at the beginning of each year to ensure that what they're actually going to be doing is within their budgetary plan. So nothing's perfect in the Premier League and Football League. It's why they've implemented these types of rules. But in the end, these clubs don't want to necessarily be bound by very stringent things that can fetter their autonomy to be able to do things. But at the same time, I think these clubs are understanding that at times of austerity, things need to be done to make sure the competition is working effectively. And the worst case scenario, you don't want clubs not fulfilling fixtures throughout the season, which then causes major issues to the fixture list.
And so, am I right? Would you? I'm probably going to set myself up for a fall here. Would you say I'm right that most football fans would just presume that when a player is transferred, that the selling club would receive payment quite promptly from the purchasing club, and that given the amount of money that's floating around in football and how high profile, particularly Champions League, Premier League football, Spanish, German football, that they would expect that these are professionally run organisations with a lot of money floating around, and that they would expect that within the sporting community that the payments to be made in a timely manner, and that sometimes, or maybe you could shed more light on it, just to explain really how frequently this is happening, because I know obviously a lot of lawyers who are involved in especially the compensation of training costs and across Europe at the moment. They seem to be getting quite a bit of work.
Do you want me to take that one first, John, or are you happy going?
Well, I mean, what I was going to say is, I think the average football fan will probably think, well, if a player's getting bought for 20 million, the purchasing club will pay 20 million up front. There it is. Bought the player, registered, done deal. But actually, the cost of a player's transfer is actually spread out over a certain amount of time, and it almost like it's a payment by instalments, which I'm sure Daniel's got more sort of knowledge about than I have, but I'm sure he can go on and explain it in a bit more detail. But I think to an average football fan, I think they'll probably expect the £20 million or whatever the fee is to be paid straight away. But in reality, it's actually spread out over a number of years.
Exactly, and more or less you get two types of phenomenon which are the same but in slightly different points. From an actual practical transaction point of view, you may get a £20 million transfer spread over 4 years, for example. So that club pays £5 million a year at a certain amount of time as stipulated in that contract, and that's from the actual practical point of the monies in the bank going to the selling club. And then from an accounting perspective, you actually have what's an issue called amortization, and I'm not an accountant, but from the FFP experience of mine, you more or less, for accounting purposes, amortize the transfer value of that player over the length of his signed contract. So 20 million over 4 years becomes 5 million amortized a year, and that becomes the cost that is put in the club accounts for that player transfer. So that's the basis point, and maybe one of the points that John alluded to earlier was what's happening more and more often these days that I'm seeing are securitization deals, which are, if a club is receiving money at a contractual point in time 6 months later down the line, but needs that cash flow of £4 million now, then they'll enter into an agreement with a bank or a loaning company, subject to the Football League and Premier League rules, that percent of that £4 million now, and the bank then, or the loan facility, manages to get the remaining amount when that amount becomes due in that 6 month time. And the problem that sometimes leads to is you're getting money now for a time that you may need it again in 6 months or a year or 2 years time. So if you're in financial difficulty, you're getting it for now, but still need it later on as well. And that can lead, and did lead, for example, to the Leeds issue, where they were securitizing ticket money, commercial revenues, in order to, I remember, to pay, I think, to buy Robbie Fowler for £12 million back in the day, and I think that looked like a good piece of business for Liverpool in the end. But regardless of that point, securitization is becoming quite popular, and for good reason, I guess, if clubs need that money.
And is this so? Coming to my next point, then, I guess, with financial management, the availability of cash to buy players, invest in development of players, that I remember speaking to the lawyer, I think it was at FC Porto, about third-party ownership and how they would struggle to operate without having access to third-party ownership. Players funded through third-party ownership. Now, that's interesting also from the securitisation point of view, because I'm sure that there's certain clubs that will have more access to that type of arrangement than others, and therefore, again, it doesn't necessarily lead to an equal playing field. However, some clubs need it more than others, and so I wonder if you could just sort of, with bearing that in mind, talk about a bit about third-party ownership, about how clubs manage their finances, about why there is such a heated debate going on across Europe and internationally in places like Argentina, which you've recently written about with Ariel on.
Sure. So very briefly, and John, feel free to come in at any time. The point generally being is that after Mr. Tevez appeared in England with West Ham, and the breach of rules that happened as a result of that, which cost West Ham at least £5.5 million from the Premier League's perspective, was that the Premier League and then subsequently the FA and the Football League brought in a prohibition that stopped any entity apart from the club owning the economic rights of a football player that was registered with an FA affiliated club. The issue that's developed more recently is that there seems to be a growing wave of enthusiasm for such a practice to be outlawed in Europe and possibly throughout the world. So I wrote to Aerial Rec recently about an Argentinian tax provision potentially just coming in, which is going to make it much more difficult for entities to own economic stakes in football players in Argentina. There seems to be similar manoeuvrings going on in Brazil at the moment from their legislative side. And then also from a football regulatory perspective, FIFA came out in their football committee and said that their aim was potentially to ban third-party ownership worldwide. Whether that's going to be possible is highly debatable. And then more recently, UEFA came out and said a very similar thing. And at least from UEFA perspective, it's much more possible simply because they run, their high-level club competitions, and the worst that they can do, I say the worst rather, but what's within their powers potentially, is to be able to restrict players who are not third-party owned, or rather they're unrestricted players that are only third-party owned from not participating in their competitions, which would obviously, disincentivize clubs from purchasing players using this third-party method because they can't play in Europe's biggest competitions with the most amount of eyeballs.
And what's the argument against third-party ownership then? What's all the fuss about then? So from the football fans, again, from a football fan's perspective, why is everyone getting so up in arms about this?
Well, they range from the emotional, no one should be owning a football player, it's akin to slavery, to probably the more rational reasons, which are either along the lines of too much money is going out of football and money should be kept in the football family because that's how it's invested and that's how it's reinvested in the grassroots of the game, to some of the arguments that I've written about a while back, which are effectively there are potential conflicts of interest if, for example, a club owner also has a stake in a club, in a player that's either playing for his club or against his club, and at the moment no one knows that. So the argument also is not necessarily between whether it should be banned or not banned, but whether actually there's a middle ground which says can it be regulated effectively, and whether actually any of the European or FIFA regulators actually want, in the most cynical sense, the hassle of regulating this, or whether an outright prohibition is actually the most straightforward way of doing things.
John, what's your view? Keep it, or get rid of it?
Well, I mean,
You've said it Forsyth.
Stay or go, come on. Be opinionated.
I mean, obviously, the third-party ownership for clubs in South America, Portugal and Spain is an important source of finance for these clubs. And with the current financial climate, what Daniel just alluded to there is as a football owner, I would probably say, with transfer fees as huge as they are, how much expenditure it is for a football club, third-party finance would surely be welcomed by many clubs in order to fund their transfer activity. And so, perhaps, why can't third-party ownership be tightly regulated instead of a worldwide sort of prohibition or a blanket sort of ban over it? So that's the argument that seems to be put forward at the minute. And as a footballer, if I was an owner of a football club, it would certainly be something that I would be certainly be welcomed in order to assist with transfer activity. And also another issue is that obviously with the with clubs who are able to source third-party finance, that obviously assist them with their financial fair play compliance. And so clubs in obviously England and also France are at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to financial fair play compliance, because they can't source any third-party finance.
So can either of you give an example? I'm thinking one that springs to mind is the Cristiano Ronaldo situation. Just to give a working example of how this would operate in practice, or how it has been operating in practice, and why it's so beneficial to some of these clubs in Portugal, for example.
I can give one brief example, which is Falcao at present. I mean, he's probably one of Europe's hottest striking properties, correct me if I'm wrong, came from Porto to Atletico a couple of seasons ago, effectively majority held by third-party entities. Otherwise, Atletico almost certainly wouldn't have been able to afford to purchase him in the first place. And now the effective point of all of this is, well, at some point that third-party entity is going to want to commercialise and realise the value of the asset, which is Falcao, and which may well be profitable for Atletico to sell. But the point being is that when that transfer happens, let's just say he transfers into Chelsea, for example, the actual mechanism by which the third-party prohibition works in the Premier League is that when that registration from the Spanish Football Federation is then transferred over to the Premier League, prior to that registration being complete, if it's Chelsea or if it's Man U or if it's City, whoever it may be, will have to reassure the Premier League through the registration department that the only entity that now has the economic, federative and registration rights is the club, and that at that point Chelsea or City or Arsenal have bought out the remaining economic rights from the third-party owner that had the contractual arrangement effectively with Atletico.
Yeah, right. That's very interesting, because doesn't that? Because I can see why this causes a problem, because this is about enforcement, isn't it, internationally, not only and across Europe. I remember it was interesting, again, some of the South American. I remember years ago going to a player contracts conference, and it was about development of players, and they couldn't afford to develop the players effectively. They couldn't afford to pay their salaries, and it was the selling of developed players who had gone through their youth system that was effectively keeping the club sustained. And part of the problem with that was corruption in their own leagues as well, which didn't help the situation because the funding wasn't working its way down to the grassroots level. And can you remind me, was there an issue a couple of years ago where FIFA were trying to regulate player agents in a similar vein, and then you had to register as a player agent, and they gave up on it because it became too burdensome for them to do?
I don't know as much about that, Sean, I'm afraid, but all I'd probably say there is what did happen was that FIFA were looking into actually doing away with their agents' regulations completely, and they doing potentially the same, because the way that they were trying to regulate it made it relatively inefficient and unworkable to be able to actually do it. So I believe there's now a debate going on about whether actually there needs to be a whole new regime in order to actually connect people who are involved in the football business to FIFA or UEFA so that they can effectively be disciplined and regulated more effectively. But I'm not the expert on agents' regs, I'm afraid.
Well, guys, thank you very much for your time. I know that you're desperate to sort of head home to your partners and families right now. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day. That was very enlightening. Hopefully we can have another chat in a few weeks' time, just about any further developments that have cropped up. In terms of the immediate future, what do you see being any apart from obviously Daniel and mentioned the Malaga situation? What should we be keeping an eye on, if anything, in the coming weeks? And don't say the Alex Ferguson retirement and see how David Moyes. I don't want to hear it.
It's for me, that one.
I'm a Liverpool fan, so I'm not even going to start barracking John or anyone else really. I'm in no position to be able to offer any insightful comments on club football.
Well, thanks for your time, guys.
No problem. Take care.
Cheers.